The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus said to his disciples, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. Amen, I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or the smallest part of a letter will pass from the law until all things have taken place. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever obeys and teaches these commandments will be called greatest in the kingdom of heaven. I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. You have heard that it was said to your ancestors, 'You shall not kill, and whoever kills shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment, and whoever says to his brother, 'Raca,' will be answerable to the Sanhedrin, and whoever says, 'You fool,' will be liable to fiery Gehenna. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there recall that your brother has anything against you, leave your gift there at the altar. Go first and be reconciled with your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Settle with your opponent quickly while on the way to court. Otherwise, your opponent will hand you over to the judge, and the judge will hand you over to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Amen, I say to you, you will not be released until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than to have your whole body thrown into Gehenna. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than to have your whole body go into Gehenna. It was also said, 'Whoever divorces his wife must give her a bill of divorce.' But I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, unless the marriage is unlawful, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to your ancestors, 'Do not take a false oath, but make good to the Lord all that you vow.' But I say to you, do not swear at all, not by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. Do not swear by your head, for you cannot make a single hair white or black. Let your yes mean yes, and your no mean no. Anything more is from the evil one." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
When I was a kid, I probably watched the original Star Wars trilogy far more times than was good for my own mental health and certainly that of my parents. But even though I really enjoyed those original trilogy of movies, one of the hardest things that I found to wrap my head around is one of the most iconic moments in those three movies. If you remember in Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, when Luke goes to be trained by Yoda, the diminutive green alien, to be a Jedi, one of the things that Yoda tells Luke, well, he's trying to get him to lift his X-Wing out of the swamp, and Luke is sort of exasperated and feeling a bit hopeless, and so with a sort of giving up shrug of his shoulders, he says, "Okay, I'll try." And Yoda very quickly and sternly cuts him off, and he says, "No, do or do not. There is no try." Now, as a kid, this drove me insane. Not only because my mom would often quote this to me when I was struggling in classes or chores around the house, But the way I was thinking about this was, how can you do anything if you do not first attempt to do so? Isn't trying a necessary prerequisite of doing anything, whether it's something small or something big? The first reading that we just heard from Sirach, that first sentence, should shoot us, if you will, between the eyes. It should pierce our conscience. And it sounds a lot like the words of Yoda. If you choose, you can keep the commandments. It's almost as though Sirach is saying, keep them. There is no trying. If you remember the larger context of the exchange between Yoda and Luke, Yoda is trying to get Luke to understand that because he does not believe it to be possible to use the Force to do things like lifting X-Wings out of the swamp, he will fail. Yoda shows him that despite his small stature, he is able to do great and powerful things. The lesson, of course, he has to believe before he can even accomplish anything. Are we like Luke? Do we think about the commandments in this way? Do we even think, before we even try or do we even think that it is possible to keep them? Or do we cut our legs off at our knees before we even begin? What do we choose? Do we choose to keep the commandments? Is this even a choice for us? Do we look at those 10 commandments that God gave Moses on Mount Sinai and think, okay, well, I don't need to be a super good person. I just need to hit right above the benchmark so I don't go to hell. So I'm going to follow 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. And the others, well, I'm going to try and focus more on them on Thursday. It's too hard. It's not possible to even keep them. Maybe when we hear the words of Sirach, if you choose, you can keep the commandments, maybe we think of that moment of choice as being that singular moment, right when our decision seems to matter the most, right when we are most beset by temptation, whether it's temptation of anger, of lust, of pride, of jealousy, of greed, whatever it might be, we might think whether we go one way or the other, whether we choose virtue and holiness or whether we choose sin and vice, as being that moment of choice. And of course, these moments are important. But just as important as these tipping points, if you will, are other moments, other choosings, other choices. Before that seeming all-important moment of decision, what choices did we make? Have we sown weeds alongside wheat? Have we sown vice and sin alongside virtue and holiness? Well, it shouldn't be a surprise for us that weeds will grow up alongside wheat if that is what we sow. The readings that we just heard, the psalm, the first reading, even the second reading, the gospel especially, challenge our assumption that we cannot, that it is impossible. Now, you might be asking yourself if your catechesis was anything like myself and, God is love, it's easy, whatever. Isn't following Christ supposed to be freeing? Isn't following Jesus supposed to be liberating? Didn't Jesus say something about that yoke, right? That heavy burden that they would lay upon the shoulders of oxen as they would plow the fields. Didn't Jesus explicitly say, my yoke is easy and my burden is light? Didn't St. Paul talk about freedom from slavery under the law, liberty of the Spirit? Jesus does not make the law easier in the ways that we are inclined to think about ease. As he explicitly tells us, not just people 2,000 years ago, but us, he deepens, he completes the law. You have heard it said, but I say to you, you shall not kill, but beware of even being angry with your brother. You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you, anyone who looks at a person with lust commits adultery in their heart. Jesus had the opportunity, if you will, to clarify and ameliorate, to make these commandments or these precepts lighter and easier, and he deliberately chooses not to. Think about how Jesus responds in his Bread of Life discourse in the Gospel of St. John, right? The people are scandalized when he claims that he will offer his flesh as food and his blood for drink. And over again, he doesn't say, well, it's just a symbol. I don't really mean it. No, he says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life within you. He does the same thing here. 4 times. You have heard it said, I say to you. Now, we might think that this is a modern question, maybe brought about by the weaknesses of modernity, that we are inclined to ease and maybe a bit too much levitas. But 500 years ago, this was something that was greatly discussed. In one of the great Christianized Socratic dialogues by St. Thomas More, his Dialogue Concerning Heresies, he writes a fictional account of himself dialoguing with a young university student who is a bit enthralled with the ideas of Martin Luther and of Luther's English followers. And in the course of their conversation, this question explicitly comes up about the ease of Christ's yoke. Thomas More says, "It is, I feel, harder not to swear at all than not to swear falsely. It is harder to forbear every angry word than not to kill. It is harder to watch and pray continually than to do so on a few designated days. And then, what about the forbearing of every idle word? What a severe threat from an earthly point of view for a seemingly small matter. Almost never was such a distressing thing said to the Jews by Moses as is said to us by Christ in that statement alone, where he says that on Judgment Day we shall give an account of every idle word. And then what do you say about his forbidding of divorce? What comfort, then, do you call this, that we are obliged, under pain of perpetual damnation, to suffer whatever kind of affliction and shameful death, whatever kind of martyrdom, for the profession of our faith? Do you believe that these ease-giving words of his easy yoke and light burden were not spoken as much to his apostles as they are to you? And yet, what ease did Christ call his apostles to? Did he not call them to watching, fasting, praying, preaching, traveling, hunger, thirst, cold and heat, beatings, scourgings, imprisonment, painful and shameful death? The easiness of his yoke does not consist in bodily ease, nor does the lightness of his burden consist in the slackening of any bodily pain, unless we are so oblivious that whereas Christ himself did not gain heaven without pain, we somehow expect to get there with play. No, the ease consists rather in the sweetness of hope, whereby we experience in our pain a pleasant taste of heaven. This is the thing, as Holy Saint Gregory Nazianzen explains, that refreshes people who are laden and makes our yoke easy and our burden light." Jesus is telling us ahead of time. He is warning us, it is not going to be easy. Don't look for an easy path if you want to be a disciple of him. Like so many others, St. Thomas More and so many other saints who suffered greatly because of their fidelity to the faith, saw the power and the importance of hope in the midst of suffering. And yes, we might be inclined to think about very, if you will, graphic or dynamic ways of sacrificing, one's body, like blood and being crucified and all those other gruesome tortures. But yes, this consists in physical suffering, but it doesn't only mean, I would say, physical suffering. It includes spiritual suffering, most specifically the sting of our conscience. And maybe this is what keeps us afraid. This is maybe what keeps us from even from obeying the commandments, because we fear failure. We fear not living up to the precepts that Christ lays before us. Now, it's important to remember at this point, hopefully you're thinking, this sounds a little Pelagian, right? Do this by yourself. And yes, indeed, Star Wars is very Pelagian, right? You've got to do it with your own, emotions or something like that. Like all of the other virtues and even anything in following Christ, the virtue of hope is only possible because we are not alone, because Christ has promised to give us his indwelling, the dwelling of the Holy Spirit within us. As we prepare to come forward to receive the great aid in the power of hope, the Holy Eucharist, the body and the blood of Christ, may we not despair when we fail to follow Christ's law, but rather hold fast